Honestly, I don't know if I'm ready to do this video. This list is just full of books everybody else loves. All right, let's do it. Let's talk about the worst books that I read in 2022. These are the books that pissed me off, that offended me, that upset me, that were boring, that I'm mad that I read. And I'm just looking at this list and I know so many of you are going to be mad. I'm sorry, I've got to speak my truth. I hated these books. I'm going to start with my books that were more like disappointing reads, and then I'm going to work right up to the books that I absolutely hated. And let's start off strong with The Heart of the Sun Warrior by Su Lin Tan. This is the sequel to Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan, which is like the Celestial Kingdom duology. The first book in this series, I really loved. I had so much fun with it. It's a very fast-paced fantasy that I just thought was a great read. And it ended up being in my top 10 favorite adult books of 2022. And so of course, I was really looking forward to the sequel coming out. And when it finally did, and I got stuck in, boy, was I disappointed. I actually read this during my Christmas vlog, so I'll leave a link to that in the cards above for you if you'd like some of my more detailed thoughts. And you can watch as the hope slowly drains from my eyes as I get further and further along in that book, before finally realizing that I just really fucking hated it. Where the first book felt fun and fast-paced and emotionally complex, the second book totally lent into the love triangle scenario, and it just felt so back and forth. Like there was no development with the love triangle, or very little of it. It just went back and forth constantly, and it was so boring and repetitive and infuriating to read. Where I really enjoyed the emotional complexity and the tension between, I mean, it wasn't really a love triangle in the first book, but we'll call it the love triangle. It goes full on the love triangle in book 2 in a way that just felt so frustrating to me. And I know there's kind of like a joke by this point of readers hating like a line, something along the lines of, I let go of a breath that I didn't even know I was holding. In this book, the line that drove me mad, because it happened every time she interacted with one of her love triangle, was like, my pulse quickened. My pulse quickened. My pulse quickened every other fucking page. Is she gonna have a heart attack or what? Like, girl, just chill. You're an immortal. It's fine. Okay, so for my 9th least favorite book, I actually have 2 books by the same author that I have very similar criticisms of, so I'm just gonna lump them together. And that is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin and Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin, which is a short story by her. And I know that some of you have already clicked off this video simply because I've mentioned her name in a worst of list. I get it. Boy, did I go on a roller coaster ride with N.K. Jemisin last year, and I wanted to love her so badly. And although the 5th season was absolutely far and away one of my favorite books of the year, one of the best fantasy books I have ever read and probably ever will read, I have to accept that the 5th season is the exception to the rule, at least for me, when it comes to N.K. Jemisin's storytelling style. The Stone Sky is the 3rd and final book in the Broken Earth trilogy, and Emergency Skin is just like a short story that's kind of separate, completely separate from the world. But it's very science fiction. And my criticisms of both are just how heavy-handed N.K. Jemisin is with her discussions of themes. It feels more like non-fiction with a couple of magical metaphors and analogies thrown in to keep your interest. So many of her characters don't really feel like people to me. They feel like placeholders for discussions for N.K. Jemisin. So many of her plot points don't feel like natural progressions of a well-executed plot and theme. Instead, they feel like ham-fisted moments for N.K. Jemisin to talk to me about an idea that she has. And like I said, I really love the themes that N.K. Jemisin chooses to tackle, and I really value her perspective on them. I just personally do not like the way that she executes them in fiction. I don't like the way that she over-explains plot twists and things that have gone on in the plot. I don't like the way that she over-explains the themes. And I think as a result of this very on-the-nose, explicit kind of handling of characters and of themes, sometimes she has the tendency to make particular characters kind of caricatures of evil or of good to make her point. That was especially true in Emergency Skin, and I just found it so off-putting. And honestly, to me, it felt like it cheapened the message of her story. Now, you could say this for anything that I'm going to say in this video, but I think especially for what I'm saying for N.K. Jemisin, this is very much a taste thing. It is very subjective. I think some people would either need that very explicit explanation of N.K. Jemisin's themes, and some people would just really love it and appreciate it and really love to know where their author is standing on these complex themes that they're raising in their works. For me, it just absolutely did not work. I did not enjoy most of what I read from N.K. Jemisin this year, and I have to finally accept that she is not the author for me. Okay, this next one I feel like I'm not going to get as much pushback on because it's not very widely known. It's Sisters of the Mist, which is like a coming-of-age graphic novel. This is essentially a story about some sisters, the oldest of which gets her period for the first time during our story. But it's kind of explored in a little bit of a magical realism, sort of fantasy kind of way. The idea of getting a period for the first time and what that means, and also just like coming to terms with growing up and coming of age, essentially. I do like the idea of this, of exploring a first period in a kind of like magical realism sort of way. However, I hated the execution. Absolutely hated it. To start with, it just felt kind of low-key turfy to me. There were a lot of like language choices, and the way that the period was framed felt very rooted in a kind of second wave feminism that is just like obsessed with female biology and like uteruses, and very much connecting all of the experiences of like periods with like childbirth, with femininity and womanhood. And to me, I just didn't like that. That felt very exclusionary to me. I also didn't like how focused the grandmother was on childbirth. And when she's talking to like her 12-year-old granddaughter, talking about how she's definitely going to have children in the future. And this is like her body's beautiful way of allowing her to have children in the future. And that framing in a book that is targeted towards young girls, that focus on an assumed life path for women and for girls, I just think is a bit icky and outdated. There's a few other little things that I didn't really like, but I think those are the core main things of why I really didn't like this graphic novel. And now we're back to the things that people are going to be mad at me about. The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. Another booktube darling. Oh my god, what a boring book. Lyrical writing, a portal fantasy realm, a queer romance. Like, these are all things I was so sure I would love. I was convinced this was going to be a new favorite book for me. Alas, it was boring as hell. There is no character development here whatsoever. This book is just a pretty setting. That is the whole book. 500 pages of a pretty setting. That's all you get. Is there a bit of a plot? Sure, but is there any point to it? Absolutely not. Is there a queer romance? Yes, but is it totally insta-lovey and you never really understand why these two people love each other? Also yes. To me, the best word to describe this was superficial. It was utterly superficial. The aesthetics, the vibes, the setting, that's all on point, but that is all you get. Plot, character development, themes, nowhere to be seen. To me though, I think I was disappointed by the lack of complexity and the lack of depth, and the fact that some people talk about this as if it's some like masterpiece. I guess I just thought that there was going to be more of those things in it. So yes, it was very pretty to read, but that's all there was, and so I was left really disappointed in this one. Next we have a manga series, and that is Son Ikoku. I actually DNF'd this after the 5th volume, I think. This is a reprinting and a reissuing of a manga series from the 80s, so it is definitely dated, and there are very, very dated elements of it. And I found those jarring right from the beginning. It's basically like a slice of life story about a young man who moves into this kind of like share house, and he's kind of a bit of a no-hoper. He keeps saying that he's going to go back to uni, but he like kind of fails the entrance exam, whatever. And there's a bunch of weird people who also live in this share house who come from all different kinds of backgrounds and walks of life, and the share house is kind of serviced and run by a beautiful young woman named Kyoko. I immediately disliked the main character, who is the young man. I'd like forgotten his name because he just becomes obsessed with Kyoko because she's pretty, and like that's his whole journey. So he's entirely objectified her, essentially. And then some of the other characters that live at the share house, like I kind of enjoyed their dynamic sometimes. Some of them I did kind of get invested a little bit in their story, but there is also like one particular character who's a man who, like, the whole gag around him is the fact that he's like a peeper, that he like breaks holes in the wall so that he can watch women dress. At the beginning of the story, that is a very small part of the story, and it's played off as a gag that like I obviously didn't like. But I loved Kyoko, the main female character. She was just gorgeous, and she had this whole backstory of like previously falling in love with like slightly older man, but just adoring him, and then he died quite young. And so she's grieving the loss of her husband still. Her parents are kind of pressuring her to get married again. She's got all these weirdos around her who like all just fall in love with her because she's pretty. But at the center of it was just this woman dealing with her grief. And I was so drawn in by her and her story. I ended up reading up to volumes 5 or 6, and I can't remember, but I know that there was one chapter that was just utterly repugnant to me in terms of the sexism. And I must have like wiped the details of it from my mind because I can't remember the specifics, but it ended up being the breaking point for me. It was the straw on the camel's back, and I could not continue. Despite how much I loved Kyoko and I was still invested in her and her story, I still love her. I hate everything else about this series and every other character pretty much. Like, it's just kind of disgusting, to be honest. And looking back on it, I am surprised that I managed to push through as far as I did. To be perfectly honest, I bought a couple of the volumes in one go because the covers were so pretty, so I already had them. And then Kyoko just drew me in. But even she could not pull me through the avalanche of sexism that was this series. Next we have I Kiss Shara Wheeler by Casey McQuiston. I know Casey McQuiston is a much loved author here on BookTube and across the book internet in general. I have not heard as much hype about I Kiss Shara Wheeler as I have about some of their previous adult books. This was their first, like, it was their debut YA novel basically. And I read it because I'd heard such good things about Casey McQuiston and because I'm a children's bookseller, so I knew we would be selling this book, and because I got an advanced listener's copy from Libro FM. But oh my god, was this book awful from beginning to end. This was awful. It's basically like this rivals to lovers story about some high school girls who are just nasty and horrible to each other. One of the girls, Shara Wheeler, is kind of like the it girl. She's the really pretty girl. She goes missing and she's left notes for 3 people to sort of like entice them into like solving the mystery of where she's gone to come and find her. We learn very early on that nothing terrible has happened to her. It isn't like a kidnapping or a murder or anything like that. She's basically run off for attention. And she is like emotionally manipulating 3 people through these letters into finding her. And it's just, I thought it was messed up. And like, obviously part of the story is about these very unlikable people, but like still finding love and all of that. But at the end of the day, to me, I just did not feel like how bad some of the things that these people do to each other, there were not really consequences for those things. And at the end of the day, just reading about mostly pretty nasty, horrible, competitive people for an entire book is just not my idea of a good time. Okay, next up is Blueberries. This is subtitled Essays Concerning Understanding by Elena Savage. This is an Australian essay collection that was honestly pushed by the Australian publishing industry in like 2021 so hard. Like, people were going gaga over this essay collection. A book that almost dares you to try and categorize or assign it a genre. Blueberries is delightfully experimental. Truly stunning and sublime, narrative non-fiction of the highest order. She's an Australian Rebecca Solnit. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. To be fair, I would have given this book 1 star if not for the very first entry in this essay collection. That first essay was honestly, it was one of the best essays I've ever read. Now, I did read this right at the beginning of the year, so I'm going to get the details probably a little bit hazy, but from memory, it was Elena, I think, returning to where maybe like 10 years prior, there had been a trial, but she had to leave before the trial had finished. And so she wanted to go back there, get the police records and files and information to find out what had happened at the end of the court case and to get some closure. And so it's this incredible story of her recounting both her experience in the first time being in this country, but then going back and sort of retreading her steps and like navigating the police system to get this information. Basically, it was really, really focused. It had this incredible emotional pull. I was honestly in awe of Elena Savage, and I was like, okay, yeah, I totally get all of the praise that this is getting. Then you get to essay number 2. And the quality, the insight, the focus was not there. Essay number 3, even worse. Essay number 4, even like it just tanked. To me, it felt like this entire book was riding on how good that first essay was. And none of the other essays even came close in comparison to me. On top of that, it just felt like the author was name dropping every kind of like vaguely leftist ideology and like random philosophy throughout. To me, it read like she knew what the talking points were that she was supposed to be covering as a progressive, but she did not have the substance to really go there on her own in detail. Which means that these essays that do tackle class and sexism and racism rarely come to any interesting or meaningful conclusion at all, which just made this whole thing read a bit cringe to me. It was so disappointing, and I just can't get over how hyped this was by the Australian publishing industry. Okay, now we're getting into the top 3. My 3rd worst book of 2022 was The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. I know, you've all been waiting for Brandon Sanderson to show up on this list. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I did an entire video for this one book, which I'll leave a link to in the cards above for you. To me, there were many problematic elements in this book, which it's disappointing to see like Fantasy BookTube not engage with whatsoever. The way that Brandon Sanderson talks about oppression is just, honestly, it's offensive. The way Brandon Sanderson deals with women in his stories, honestly offensive. And the ableism, like I had not heard anyone talk about the ableism in Mistborn, but it's there and it's gross. And on top of that, this book and this series is like the most predictable thing you could ever imagine. Halfway through my vlog of like reading this book, I was so bored that I decided to give a list of things that I thought were gonna happen. And I based pretty much all of those, I based on 2 things. I based them on the idea that one character was a Brandon Sanderson like self-insert. And so I was thinking more about what would Brandon Sanderson do rather than what the story has set up so far. And the other thing I was basing it on was just like what had happened in the previous 2 books. Those were the only 2 things I needed to know in order to like predict almost everything about the ending of this book. It was just dull. It was predictable. It was boring. It was tedious. It was way, way, way too long for what it was. And I suppose this is a little bit of a spoiler, but I absolutely hated the way that we tried to have a redemption arc for the Lord Ruler in book 3. In book 1, it was very clear that the Lord Ruler had instituted these systems of like literal eugenics and systematic rape and oppression and enslavement, and you're going to try and give that guy a redemption arc? Anyway, I just thought this was absolutely terrible, and it is the 3rd worst book that I read in 2022. Okay, but let's give Brandon Sanderson and Mistborn a little bit of a break. We're going to talk about my second least favorite book of the year, and that was Dawn of the Arcana. This is volume 1 of a manga series that I just got out at the library because, you know, it was volume 1 and they don't often have a lot of volume 1s available at the library. But this was awful. I honestly would have DNF'd it had it not been such a quick read. And it's been so long that I don't remember all the specifics, but basically it's sort of like about 2 kingdoms who are at war. And so one kingdom like sells off their daughter to be married to the other kingdom to hopefully create some peace. But it turns out that the prince that she has to marry is like absolutely horrible. Like he is abusive, but you can just tell that he's going to be set up to become some like bad boy romantic interest. And that just repulsed me. Absolutely repulsed me. The other love interest, because it is a love triangle, you gotta have a love triangle, is a male character who is sort of like a caretaker for this princess. But we have a flashback to him being a grown man while she's a child. So basically this is a fantasy love triangle setup where the main character's choices are between an abusive bad boy and a man who has like potentially groomed her in her entire life. Like, no, absolutely not. Okay, and now for my absolute least favorite book of the year, the worst book that I read in 2022. I think everybody knows it by now. It's Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. Congratulations, 2 out of the top 3. This is another one that I've done a full reading vlog of, so I'll leave that in the cards above for you if you'd like to see me talk about how much I hate this book for 25 minutes. To be fair, I went into this book with very high expectations. I actually quite liked The Final Empire. I had my criticisms of it, but ultimately I just thought it was so much fun that I was really looking forward to the rest of the series. Clearly that didn't go very well. This book, I have very similar criticisms that I did for The Hero of Ages. I hate the way that Brandon Sanderson has dealt with oppression and an oppressed, enslaved class in his world. The way that he represents them as meek and homogenous and essentially not able to rule for themselves and not wanting to rule for themselves. Basically, they just need like the ruling classes to be slightly less mean to them. Like that's the goal. Honestly, I could have put The Hero of Ages here because especially like that redemption arc for the Lord Ruler is just utterly disgusting to me. But I think The Well of Ascension was just such a turning point for me of realizing how much I disliked Brandon Sanderson as a storyteller, how much I disliked his choices and how predictable they had become to me. And so I think like The Hero of Ages and Well of Ascension are about on par in terms of like how much I don't like them. But in terms of which one disappointed me more, that was definitely The Well of Ascension. On top of that, this was just a really boring book. The Hero of Ages, it was pretty boring too, but at least there was some stuff happening and you could kind of see that there was going to be some payoff at the end. Well of Ascension was just literally filler. It was like just taking up time, moving people around in the right spaces and like giving you some backstory on some characters, and like it was just boring. Anyway, if you want to hear me ranting more about Mistborn, like I'll leave those videos in the description box below for you because they're lengthy and boy do I rant. Okay, we're done. Believe it or not, I genuinely prefer talking about books that I love rather than ranting about books that I hate. Honestly, I found this quite draining, but I hope you found it entertaining. I hope you get to avoid some books that maybe you wouldn't like either if you're a reader with similar tastes to me. Or if you vehemently disagree with me and you're super mad right now, I hope you at least had some fun typing out that hate comment. Don't forget to check out the 4 videos that I made for my favorite books of 2022. I made a book each for my favorite junior fiction, middle fiction, young adult, and adult books. Let me know in the comments below which books you absolutely hated in 2022. I hope for your sake that that list is short. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie for their very generous support. And thank you for watching all the way through this angry, miserable mess. I'll talk to you in the comments and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, I hope you only read great books that you absolutely love. Okay, bye.